Welcome to CGD. This was quite a last-minute invite, so very pleased that people have come to spend their Monday lunchtime listening to, I think, what's my favourite paper of 2019 so far. So very pleased to welcome Gautam Rao to CGD. He's an associate professor at the Department of Economics at Harvard. He received his PhD in economics from UC Berkeley in 2014 and spent a year at Microsoft before moving to Harvard. His research brings insights from psychology to other topics in education, particularly relevant to developing countries. Another one of my favourite all-time papers is one of his previous ones on mixing rich and poor kids in schools in Delhi, showing that mixing poor and rich kids together makes rich kids nicer in many ways. And I would definitely recommend you check out his back catalogue because it's fantastic. The study we're going to hear about today is whether research affects policy making. We know lots of research gets done, lots of policy gets made, lots of talk about evidence-based policy making, especially by people like us here at CGD. But does information actually influence what policymakers do, or do people just believe research that backs up their priors? So excited to hear what Gautam found in his study. He's going to talk for about 25-30 minutes, and then my colleague Lee Crawfurd is going to provide some reflections. Lee is a senior research associate here at CGD in the global education team. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Sussex, and he was previously an economist and advised within the governments of Rwanda, South Sudan, and the UK. We'll then open to questions, and I hope we'll have a lively debate throughout lunch. Do please feel free to interrupt Gautam with any questions that are sort of clarifying in nature during the presentation. Otherwise, we'll keep the majority of the discussion to the end. Over to you, Gautam.
So thanks for the lovely introduction. It's lovely to be here and to talk about this work that's joint work with Jonas Hjort at Columbia Business School, Diana Moreira at UC Davis, and Juan Santini, who was a PhD student in Brazil at the time, is now a postdoc at IPA. So, as you guys know, there's been an explosion of social science research in the last few decades that evaluates particular programs or policies. But, our motivation is understanding, do policymakers value such information? Does encountering such research actually shift their beliefs? And eventually, do they actually act on new information from research? And how does this depend upon characteristics of the research, such as its internal versus external validity, which, for instance, development economists worry a lot about, on aspects of the policies, such as partisan support for the policies, and on the characteristics, incentives, and prior beliefs of the policymaker themselves. And second, and a bit more broadly perhaps, what are the barriers to the adoption of cost-effective policies? In my field of development economics, we study a lot technology adoption, for instance, in the domain of agriculture. But what about adoption of effective policies similarly? Are information frictions important in practice between research and policy, perhaps also between actors within government, for instance, between policymakers and bureaucrats in either direction? Or are the barriers exclusively other factors like political incentives or technical capacity? Of course, this question we're not, by any means going to be able to answer in any general setting. Where, what we're going to provide here is more a proof of concept. So, motivated in these ways, we're going to report to you today 2 experiments we ran with municipalities and municipal officials in Brazil. The first experiment, which we're going to call the demand or beliefs experiment, which was named by committee, will be with 900 municipal government officials from across Brazil. And this was going to be more of sort of an experimental economics lab in the field type experiment. What we're going to do is we're going to use tools from experimental economics to measure willingness to pay. So sort of demand, how much are policymakers willing to pay in some sense out of their pockets to learn the findings from research on early childhood development programs. But what's the effect of some of these programs on student outcomes? We're going to measure how much they're willing to pay to learn the answer, but then also how their beliefs shift as a result of encountering the answer. Okay? And how this depends upon attributes of the studies and the policymakers. For instance, what country was the study done in? How large was the sample size of the study? Okay? A second experiment, which is going to be more of sort of a large-scale field experiment, was conducted with about 1,800 recently elected or re-elected mayors in 2016. And what we did here was invite half of these mayors, or about half of these mayors, to a training session where we were going to give them about a 45-minute long training on research evidence on a very particular policy or a policy tool, which is reminder letters to get people to pay their taxes on time. So a low-cost, simple policy that's been found to be effective in multiple studies. And then we measure actual policy adoption about a year or two later. Okay. So just a little bit about the context. Many of you, may know even more than me about Brazil, but municipal governments in Brazil are a useful and convenient sort of context to study this. There's an executive headed by the elected mayor who appoints in turn secretaries of finance, education, etc., to lead the bureaucracy. The mayor's term is about 4 years and can serve at most 2 consecutive terms. Mayors are pretty autonomous and they're actually responsible for the execution of certain key state functions, and our experiments touch on 2 of these. One is local tax revenues and the other is early childhood education or development programs. The reason we're able to do this work is that we partner with a non-partisan confederation of municipal governments, which organizes a number of big conferences each year, which are attended by many mayors and sometimes by municipal secretaries and the like. And we participate in those conferences and use them as a convenient place to get, in some cases tens, but in some cases even thousands of these politicians or policymakers together in one place. Okay, so that's how we're able to do these large-scale experiments. All right, so let me dive into the first experiment, the one about demand or willingness to pay and about policymaker beliefs. So how does this work? It's unusual for mayors and municipal secretaries to be doing experimental economics games where their willingness to pay for research findings and so on, are elicited. So it's kind of an odd thing to be doing. How do we make sure this actually makes sense and they understand what's going on and what the purpose of the exercise is? So we introduce the study. They, of course, know they're part of a research study. We describe to them early childhood development programs in some detail. We provide an illustrative example that resonates for them, the Criança Feliz ECD program in Brazil. We describe the key outcome measures by which researchers have often evaluated these programs, at least in the 4 to 5 year time horizon, which is typically looking at test scores or what we somewhat confusingly, I think, called cognitive skills. And we explain the units in which these are measured, standardized effect sizes. And we provide, just for sanity's sake, provide benchmarks for effect sizes. For instance, how much do test scores increase over the course of 1 more year of education, what that correlation is in Brazil, on a very well-known standardized test in Brazil. Okay? So we're helping make all of this, broadly make sense. And then here's how the experiment actually works. First, we elicit what we call your prior beliefs. That is, before you've learned about the finding of any study, we ask you to think hard and predict, if this program was implemented, what would its effect be? First, and perhaps what we're most interested in, is what you believe the effect would be in your own municipality if this was done. But we also ask you what you think the effect was when a program like this was implemented in certain other locations. These are locations where the program was actually evaluated by researchers using RCTs. So in some sense, we know what the quote-unquote true answer was in those locations. And we can even provide incentives to to the participants to give accurate predictions here. That is, if their answer is more accurate, they're going to receive a larger payoff from participation in the experiment. We vary the size of these incentives. It doesn't matter. Essentially, people take this quite seriously and are doing their best, is our sense. Okay, so we find out what you think the effect would be once you've understood what policy we're talking about. Then we're going to randomly pick 1 of 4 studies we identified in the literature that are fairly comparable, that are all evaluations using RCTs of early childhood development programs. And we're going to pick 1 of these 4 studies and offer it to you for purchase. Okay? What are we going to tell you about the studies? Essentially two things: the country or the location of the study and the sample size of the study. We don't use sort of these leading labels I'm showing you: small sample, large sample, developing country, rich country. We just tell you what's in here. But what we have, the way we think about this in our analysis, is that we have two studies that are in rich countries, actually both in the US, one just in Michigan and one across multiple states in the US, and two studies that are in developing countries in Jamaica and Colombia. Similarly, two studies, one each in a rich country, one in a poorer country, that are small sample, about 130 participants, and two other studies that are large sample, about 1,400 in one case and 4,700 in the other case. Okay, and these are the two dimensions we're gonna think about. How much are they willing to pay for studies that are large sample versus small sample, and in rich countries versus poorer countries? Okay. Our initial our guess when we were designing this is that these participants would not really attend to sample size of the study. We thought this would be a somewhat obscure statistical detail, but that they would care a lot about the country the study was done in, because they might think that, look, something that works in the US or in Michigan may not be very relevant to my context. It may lack external validity, whereas perhaps something done in Colombia, right across the border from me, might in fact be quite relevant. Okay. All right, so but what do? We pick one of these studies and we offer it to them. Now, what is it? How do we actually elicit your willingness to pay? What does this mean? So the currency, we didn't want to do this, with straight dollars, because there would have been some sensitivity to this. So the currency in our experiment, and also the incentive to participate, was that each participant received lottery tickets, and the payoff of the lottery ticket was a free trip to the US, where we'd help you also with the visa and so on, and flights and hotel stay. Often this would be a trip to Boston, and then you'd get a tour of campus, from one of the researchers at Harvard University. But other people flew to chose other locations. Okay, so you get a bunch of lottery tickets, and then you're allowed to instead give up some of these lottery tickets to purchase the finding of the research. Okay, so it's sort of costly for you. Just anecdotally, participants were really stoked about these lottery tickets. People were really excited about them. I think valued them quite a lot. We later do an exercise to compare the lottery tickets to just plain old dollars using sort of gift cards. I'll tell you about that in a bit. Okay, so a participant, supposing they say something like, I'm willing to pay 20 out of my 100 lottery tickets to find the study results. Then we're going to randomly draw a price. And essentially they have incentives to tell what their true valuation of the study is. Because if they said, I'm willing to pay 20 and the price we draw is 21, they don't get the result. Whereas if they said 20 and we draw a price of 19, we charge them 19 and they get the result. Okay? So it's sort of a standard technique from experimental economics. All right. We then sort of, essentially because this price is randomly drawn, we have some random variation in whether you got the result or not. Okay? And so if you got the study result, that means, what we give you here is a very simplified bottom line effect size. Like you've often seen as sort of the bottom line from an RCT. So something like saying the study of 130 students in Jamaica found that the increase in cognitive skills or test scores 4 years later was 0.4 units, 0.4 standard deviations. That's what you're paying for, is that sort of simplified bottom line result. And if you receive such a result, if you randomly received it, we're then going to measure whether your beliefs have changed. So we ask you again, now what do you think the effect in your municipality would be? Okay? And of course, a person could say, well, I don't think I learned much from Jamaica about my municipality. I don't think the answer would change much. Or they could think they learn a lot and they could change their belief quite a bit. And we're going to measure how much they change their belief. All right. And finally, I won't show you results on this, but at the end of this experiment, we give them a new stock of lottery tickets, and we allow them to purchase practical policy implementation information, sort of more nuts and bolts information on how these ECD programs work. The idea is to take a baby step in this, even in this experiment, towards understanding if research changed your beliefs about the effectiveness of the policy, does that then further cause you to sort of take a little step towards learning more about how to actually do the policy? Okay? And we find the answer there is yes. But the next experiment will be more sort of focused on policy adoption itself. Okay. So the first thing we find is actually there's substantial willingness to pay. Initially, people got a stock of 100 lottery tickets. On average, they're willing to pay about 45 of them to learn the findings of a single study. There's a lot of variation. The standard deviation there is pretty big. However, 98% of participants were willing to pay some strictly positive amount. Now, what is 45 lottery tickets? Like, is that a big amount? Is that a small amount? It's sort of a weird made-up currency. So in part of our study, we allowed people to use these lottery tickets instead to buy gift cards that are kind of like Amazon gift cards. So really effectively just like cash. So we can benchmark how much that is, against cash. And essentially, this is the 45 lottery tickets is about $36 US. Okay. So they're willing to pay $36 US to find the result of this study. Now, some of you, by the way, might be thinking, well, but couldn't they just go look up the study by themselves anyway? So for free, so why this? And yes, and perhaps some of them might, but I think A, there are language barriers. B, there's perhaps limited technical capacity to process the thing. Even finding the thing may not actually be super easy. But certainly some of them may be thinking about it. I think you should think of this as your willingness to pay to receive immediately a simplified, bottom line, finding on something. Okay. The next thing I want to highlight to you is that participants, contrary to what we expected, are willing to pay more for larger sample studies. On an average of 45, they're paying about 3.8 lottery tickets more for a large sample study, but they're not willing to pay more for the 2 developing country studies, that we considered compared to the 2 US studies. So, one interpretation of this is that, well, they actually do care about things like sample size, and perhaps they don't think that there's a lot of difference in the external validity of results from the US versus Colombia. Now, you might think that they just think they're all equally invalid or the like, but then why would they be paying for it? And as I'll show you soon, they actually do change their beliefs. They just don't seem to weight them differently. Okay? It may be worth flagging here that Brazil is a very, it's a heterogeneous middle-income country, and there are parts of Brazil where people may see themselves as closer to the US and parts of Brazil where people may see themselves as closer to Colombia. We find a little hint of evidence in that direction when we split up the sample, but really nothing very statistically robust. Okay. Just when we try to look at who is willing to pay more for these research findings, really the main thing that stood out to us is, for instance, term limits don't predict much. That is, if you're up or not for re-election next time, we thought, well, maybe that matters, whether you care to learn this useful information, and it doesn't. But places that already implement some form of early childhood development program, or participants who've heard of them, even though their municipality does not implement them, are willing to pay more. This sort of makes sense, but it could have gone in a different direction. It could be if you already do this, have been doing this for a while, you think you already know everything there is to know about this, and you don't think some research from another country is useful for you. Okay. Now, this is what happens to participants' beliefs if they've seen the study. This is a regression where the outcome variable is your updated belief, and we're going to see how much weight you're placing on your earlier belief, your prior belief, and what we're calling the signal here is the study effect size. Okay? So if initially you thought the effect was 0, and then you were told the effect is 1, if you end up at, say, 0.5, that means you're placing equal weight on the two, something like that. And what we find is people understandably place a great deal of weight on their prior belief, about 70%, but they are actually placing about 30, they're moving 30% of the way towards the study finding that they are presented with. Okay? There's a lot of other sensible things here that I won't go into much detail, but for instance, when they're asked about the effect in their own municipality, which you'd expect they would think that they know more about than about when we ask them, what do you think the effect was in Jamaica? Well, they place more weight on their prior belief when it's about their own municipality. And interestingly, I didn't get into this in the interest of time, but we do this not once, but we repeat this again to see if they'll pay for a second study once they've already learned perhaps a first study. And we find that they will pay for a second study and they will place some weight on it, but less weight than they placed on the first one. Right? So it's not just that they think one study is enough and there's nothing to be learned beyond that. They are willing to sort of pay and update more for the second study, but in a diminishing way. Okay. This ghastly table, I'll just tell you sort of the bottom line, really, what you want to take away from this is that you place more weight on the study, that is in terms of how you update your belief, when it was a large sample study, but not when it was from a developing country. So that lines up exactly with the willingness to pay result. Remember, I told you you pay more for a study that's large sample, right? But not for a developing country study. Similarly, you change your beliefs more when you learn the result of a large sample study and not a developing country study. Okay, so those two things are consistent with each other. Now, I have to admit, we were a bit surprised by this, so we debrief a subset of participants about which studies they preferred and why they thought the study was more useful or informative. And for the people who preferred large sample studies, about 60% of them, when they were eventually given multiple choice answers, actually said, chose some version of precision, that we learned something that's more precise from this large study. However, a substantial share also say something else that I think is quite interesting, which is that from the large sample studies, they inferred that this was not some small pilot program, but rather was implemented at scale by government, and that's more informative. Right? So, they correctly inferred that the N=130 study in Jamaica was, in fact, sort of a small-scale program, and that the one with thousands of students across states in the US was a large-scale program. Okay. All right. Very quickly, I work in behavioral economics, and I was very interested in, do we find evidence for what's often called motivated reasoning? That is, people processing information in a way that accords with their priors or sort of, is in line with their preferred position, what they'd like to believe. And I won't get into exact details, but we test for different versions of this. One is called asymmetric updating, which is, do you respond more to good news versus bad news about the efficacy of a program? Confirmation bias, which is sort of, if I was already pretty bullish on the program, I then really neglect negative information, but weight positive information and the reverse, and vice versa. And politically motivated reasoning, where we inform people that the previous center-left governments had really supported this policy. Does that change their beliefs, their openness to information, or how they process research findings? Now we have, by no means is this the most, early childhood development is by no means sort of the most politically loaded or salient topic in Brazil, but really we find evidence for none of these things. So on the last one, maybe we have limited statistical power, but broadly there's just no compelling evidence in our sample that any of this motivated reasoning is going on. So I think we would like to push back a bit against this narrative that everything in the world is just confirmation bias and providing information is hopeless and useless because everyone processes this information in a hopelessly biased way. I mean, this may be true in some domains. I do believe this is motivated reasoning is a thing in the world, but it isn't generically and universally the case. Okay, I need to speed up a little bit. Well, fortunately, the second experiment is a simpler one to explain, so I can be a bit quicker. So This was at a giant conference. This was implemented at a giant conference where thousands of mayors, descend on Brasilia soon after, elections. So these are all recently elected mayors. And it's a big conference with many parallel training sessions going on. And we get sort of one small room in parallel with other sessions where our experimental sample is going to be mayors who are registered to attend this conference, restricted to municipalities, between 5,000 and 100,000 inhabitants, which is, I think 80% plus of municipalities in Brazil. And we cover about 54% of all such municipalities. So we're going to randomize treatment and control assignment within this. And what is the treatment? The treatment is just inviting you, sending you an email, an SMS, etc., to invite you to our training session. We can't enforce participation here. So one outcome will be if we invite you, do you show up? And what is the invitation telling you? It's saying it's about research on how to increase local tax revenues. Importantly, in terms of interpretation, it does mention the involvement of researchers from Harvard and Columbia. So it's just a 45-minute long information session where we have, fairly slick slides and a good presenter, in Portuguese, giving a presentation on research on how to increase tax compliance. Participants are also presented with a policy brief which they can take home with them. So the first result is that about 40% of invited mayors attend the session, even though there's a lot else they could be doing with their time, having political meetings, going to other sessions, and so on. College-educated and younger mayors are more likely to attend, conditional on being invited. Term limits, again, don't seem to do anything. Left versus right is a little bit tricky to define in Brazil, but also, however we measure that, doesn't really predict much. And at the municipality level, if we look at things like the poverty level, the population, income per capita, at the municipality level, that doesn't seem to predict participation at all, which was a little surprising to us. Here's what the training session looks like. And what were we actually telling them? We were telling them about the findings from 12 RCTs, including a famous one from this country, evaluating the effect of reminder letters to taxpayers to get them to pay their taxes on time. So this is surprisingly effective, increasing compliance, which is measured differently in each study, by an average of 12% across studies. There's evidence also from Latin America, from Argentina and Peru. And these letters have sort of different aspects, like mentioning the due date, mentioning the possibility of fines or audits, using social norm language, like most of your neighbors pay their taxes on time, don't be the only one who doesn't. Here's an example of the letter. I skip over this. This is a relevant problem. Why did we pick this? Well, first, most municipalities raise some kind of local taxes. Compliance with these taxes is a problem. Reminder letters are already used to some extent. We later find that about 30% of the control group uses something that we would classify as a reminder letter. But of course, as you must be already thinking, this is sort of a best case scenario. We're choosing a policy that's really low upfront financial costs, easy to implement, probably not that politically loaded in any way. You're not going to horribly upset some ally by sending out reminder letters. Okay. So we reach out to every municipality in the sample about 1.5 to 2 years after this, and we survey tax bureaucrats as well as mayors. We're able to get about 80% of municipalities with no differential attrition and so on. And the key thing we find is that if you participated in the information session, that makes you 10 percentage points more likely to be using reminder letters 1.5 to 2 years later. That's on a base of about 30 percentage points in the control group. So it goes from around 30 to 40% of municipalities in the treatment group now using reminder letters. I skip this. All right, so let me conclude. Our initial motivation was to ask, do policymakers value learning about research on policy effectiveness, and does this actually change their beliefs and actions? And are information frictions actually important for policy adoption and practice? And what we find is that Brazilian mayors actually do have a meaningful demand for research information, both in their willingness to pay in a more lab setting and in the field, which is willing to spend pretty valuable time attending these training sessions. They're quite sophisticated in their processing of this information. I should be careful, at least, they do respond to some things that we think they should, such as sample sizes of studies, both for statistical precision and for sort of scale of implementation reasons. We find no evidence really that on average, that's not quite right, on average they care about external validity, or rather that they see the location of the study as capturing useful variation in external validity, on average across Brazil. And we find little evidence of motivated processing of information. And sharing information on effective policy actually led to some policy change. Just last slide, maybe some of these things come up in questions or discussions. This is a very baby first step to understanding these topics. Well, no, so first step by us. There are many others who've also studied related things. There are many channels through which research can affect policy, and only one of them, I think we're not naive enough to think that the main one or the only one is taking literally, here's the research finding and telling it to a policymaker and everything will change. We know there's other ways that research can affect policy through the aid sector, through education, and so on. But communicating research findings directly can be effective, is our conclusion. I think this is consistent with recent evidence on the fact that even citizens change their beliefs and even some behaviors, even on politically loaded topics like immigration, minimum wage, and so on in the US when presented with research findings in a neutral way. Of course, there are many challenges and pitfalls. One thing we found in pilot work is that about half the mayors reported that they had no idea that such research even existed. Because you might ask, well, if they're willing to pay for it, if they change their beliefs, why aren't they just finding it already? Well, if you don't even know it exists, then you don't know there's anything to search for. And of course, as you guys may have encountered in your work, we were unable to answer plenty of very practical questions that mayors would ask us. So should we have this kind of curriculum or that kind of curriculum? Does the teacher need a master's degree or not? And these are things that, as researchers, at least in economics, we're often not delving enough into the details to be able to answer those questions. There's some existing market failure, right? The fact that they care about this, they're willing to pay, it changes their beliefs. I think translating from academic jargon, communicating uncertainty, translating across context, these are all things I think people in this room, many of you are working on bridging this gap. But there are many unanswered questions. First, would bad evidence be just as convincing? Right? So we have a little bit of pilot evidence when we've not yet exploited on this, but I think that's an important thing to understand. Was this about the message, the content of what we're telling them, or was it all just that some people from Harvard and Columbia showed up and they therefore assume everything we say, is useful and makes sense and should be believed? And might the real world issue, I frame this as there's a lack of information access. Could the real issue be exactly the opposite, that there's information overload? That in fact, there's plenty of motivated actors out there telling you this works, this works, this works, and it's hard to sort of sort these things out and figure out, what really does work. And of course, we chose only a couple of policies, relatively politically neutral things. So, I think lots more work to be done, but hopefully this is a useful start. Thank you.
Very much, Gautam. That was, I think, for all of us at CGD, it means that we can breathe a sigh of relief that we do have a purpose in life after all, and any donors in the room should keep funding us to do that work. I'm going to turn to Lee now for his responses. Feel free to take a seat, Gautam, or stay standing, whichever you feel more comfortable doing.
So yeah, thanks again, very much for a brilliant talk and a brilliant paper. Also, one of my favourites this year, I think, not least for justifying our existence. I think taking your willingness to pay estimates, if it's $36 per participant by 1,000 participants, I think you could probably turn around a policy brief for $36,000 if there's anyone in the market. Thanks everyone for coming, and congrats on being allocated to the seminar. There's a far less interesting at all. We'll be spared anyway. So, a couple of questions on the paper. First of which is me being lazy and not doing this research, but perhaps you can give me a better answer anyways. The extent to which these experimental games have been validated in real world settings, which your paper does by looking at the actual policy adoption. But I'm just curious about how much of the literature there is around validating those games, real money, real stakes. And then you kind of anticipated these questions about external validity, but really curious about whether you think we would expect to see similar effects in other policy areas, maybe more contentious policy areas, and maybe just more difficult to implement areas, like presumably you picked these interventions for specific reasons based on what evidence was there and what might be implementable. You didn't choose the ECD policy to measure if people are actually implementing that. How should we think about that, I suppose? Are policymakers more likely to listen to evidence, less likely to listen to evidence when things get more complicated? And there's a lot of talk about Brexit here at the moment, where the politicians seem to be actively hostile to experts. Is there anything unusual in particular about Brazilian politics? Aware about when thinking about how this might get in other settings? Like obviously it's tricky to find the kind of setting where you can study these questions basically where you have enough decision makers to do these kind of experiments. I'd love to know how you think we should build on this kind of research journey. For a related question is what we should think, how we should think about the external validity of the findings you have and how they would translate into. We don't know for sure that ECD in Brazil is effective, right? It might be the risk that you mislead people into thinking that they might be more effective than they truly would be. Related to that is the paper by colleagues here, Hans Pritchard, Justin Sandifer, the role of context versus research methods. How in many cases you might be better with relational study from your context versus the evidence from a different. I think that would be a fantastic study to do, right? To include that derivation, you could have included an observation study from Brazil if it exists. I presume you collected the best RCT evidence from around the world. And related, this notion of the marginal study, they're most interested in first, maybe not the second. To what extent should policymakers be learning from the body of evidence rather than studies? We're going to think that's the case. Perhaps we should be comparing a systematic review with an RCT with an OLS study, see what policymakers respond to, and if they respond appropriately more to a systematic. And then one final comment just on your point, which you also posted in your Twitter thread about the paper, about all these other questions that the players had, and I'd love to see a list of what those questions were. And then how do you think about, the so what question? What should we all do differently, given that there seems to be this mismatch in the demand from policymakers and the supply of research? Does it just fall on think tanks like CGD to try and do that communication? Should we do anything differently? Should academics do anything differently, given all the incentives you face to come up with cool new methods versus answering a really boring vanilla policy question? Won't get published. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Lee. Let's take some time to respond to that, Gautam, and then we'll open up.
Okay, how much time we have? Because I could take a very long time to respond to the questions.
We have a stop at around 2 o'clock. We can keep going for as long as we want to within that time.
So maybe
I'm sure there's lots of other questions in the room though.
First, there was a question about, these willingness to pay games and so on. Are they validated? Yeah, so there's been work in the field comparing a very simple take it or leave it. Do you want to buy this water treatment, like chlorine tablets or something at this price, yes or no, compared to doing the whole fancy apparatus we do, and these things are fairly correlated. I wouldn't take the $36 figure as too seriously. That could be off by a bit, but certainly these methods have been validated. I've used them in many studies, and they're tricky to do, but I think they capture some pretty meaningful variation. Let me see. Okay, so there was a question about, is there something unusual about Brazilian politicians? You mentioned sort of Brexit, what's going on there. I think people in Brazil, from what I can understand, including my Brazilian co-author and the PhD student who worked in Brazil, certainly wouldn't have thought that Brazilian mayors are particularly sophisticated, particularly interested in research evidence. So in some sense, I think the media coverage in Brazil has also reflected this fact that people are a little bit surprised by this, which maybe should make us worry about our study a little bit. But I think what's going on here is, I think when we focus on things like Brexit, which are of course super important, we forget that a whole lot of things, and particularly I think things at the municipal government level, are really not that politically loaded, are really sort of technocratic. My colleague Ed Glazer, who studies cities, would say, mayors have to figure out how to get potholes fixed, and that's really what they care about. And a lot of municipal politics is not extremely ideological. And there's work in the US as well showing this, Republicans versus Democrats as mayors don't really choose very different policies or the like. So I think there's a whole lot that these Brazilian mayors do that just isn't very political. And so I think that's where there's probably going to be the most traction from providing this information, and that's where you're not going to find all this motivated processing of information. So might we be misleading participants? Should they be updating their beliefs like this? Would ECD actually work in Brazil? I think great question. So everything in our study here is purely a description of how they do react. We have no idea how they should react. As I mentioned, they place 70% of the weight still on their prior. So it's not as if we tell them, here's what happened in Jamaica, and they say, that's exactly what would happen in my municipality. They only move 30% of the way towards that. So they don't believe in and trust their own judgment and priors quite a lot. How much, is 30% too much or too little weight? I'm not sure. I get the feeling that sometimes researchers or development economists, we think it should be 100% weight. We did a paper that found this, and so that's now the truth. That's clearly not what these mayors are doing, but they're also not placing zero weight. So I don't know what they should be doing. I think it's a great suggestion to have offered them instead some more observational study in Brazil and see if they'd place more weight on that. No, we didn't do that. I completely agree that providing policymakers with a body of evidence makes a ton of sense. There's a very recent paper, and it's cited in my paper. It's part of this Meta-Keta initiative that a bunch of, I think, political scientists have been doing, where one of the studies was, they did a meta-analysis based on a bunch of studies, and then they did an experiment kind of like ours of providing some policymakers. I think these were people working at the World Bank and so on. I could be wrong. They provided them with the findings of the meta-analysis, and again showed that they changed their beliefs and so on. So providing them a single study versus meta-analyses, I think that would be also interesting. There's other work recently by Eva Vivelt and Aidan Colville that similarly provides policymakers with multiple studies and sees how they change their beliefs. So I think that's an active area of research. It would be good to know how policymakers think about observational studies versus RCTs and the like. Of course, that's going to depend on, one question is, if you just I think if you just showed up with mayors in Brazil and said this was an RCT and this was a correlation, it's sort of a bit of an unfair question. I don't know if they'd, how much they'd understand these things. We did explain to them that in these studies, one set of students are randomly assigned to not receive it, and one set of students are randomly assigned to receive it. So they should be similar otherwise on average. So we explained something about RCTs. How much weight would they place on observational studies? This is something worth finding out. How much weight should they place? Also worth finding out, and I think we don't quite know. What was other questions there? I agree with you that other policy areas where implementation may be harder, things may be more politically loaded, things could be quite different. You're right. We exactly picked reminder letters for taxpayers as almost a laughably easy policy to implement. And yet, before doing it, by no means did I have a very strong prior that, oh yes, this is going to work. They're going to adopt these things. I've worked with state governments in India, for instance, where at a state level ministry, you can't find a single person capable of doing an Excel, like a mail merge or like, a simple calculation in Excel. So sending fresh letters to taxpayers in time before the due date, it's one of the easiest things you can do, but it's still not obviously easy for all municipalities to do. And indeed, our effect sizes are only 10 percentage points. Right? So there's a lot of people that still aren't adopting. And I agree that as you get to more expensive and difficult to implement policies, I don't think we would have seen anything there. Okay, so what should we do differently? That I haven't thought enough about. I think one thing that is striking in many developing country contexts, or one thing that was very striking when I moved to the US from India, is just how many organizations, institutions, think tanks exist that do this translation of research to evidence, and how much senators and Congress, representatives in the US will perhaps selectively, but still cite research findings in their speeches and the like. And this is not a thing we had much of in India. And so I think there's just a huge role for organizations that bridge this gap. I don't think it's really researchers' comparative advantage to be doing this. I think, by the way, even in Brazil where we work, whenever I give this talk, I say if there's anyone that's interested in working with this CNM, this Confederation of Municipalities, I think they were a great partner. They were eager to do more of this. And like many partner organizations, they really cared about doing something actually useful for their constituents, for the mayors, which I think is a good discipline that's hard to impose on academics who are trying to do some intellectually interesting work. So I think there's a huge role for this. I don't think it's really the comparative advantage of academics. I think for places like CGD, other think tanks to be doing this is potentially very high value. But you need to have, my guess is, the credibility, sort of the sort of be seen as sort of nonpartisan, and because otherwise I think there probably are a ton of actors out there trying to tell the mayors this works and that works. So I'm not sure any of that was particularly insightful, but that's what I had to say about the very thoughtful comments. But happy to take more questions or just have a discussion around the table.
So you sort of turn up with your fancy Harvard and Columbia brands, and clearly that gave you very good access and an open door for them to listen to you. But even in this country, we know that ministers often listen to people who may not be researchers, who may not be evidence-based. It might be their friend who runs a edtech company, or it might be a special advisor. So did you have any kind of insights into the competing influencers that are talking to those mayors and how they sort of prioritized your interventions? And secondly, so something that I was struck by during your talk was, are organizations like CGD at a global level, but sort of national equivalents, think tanks and so on, are they missing a trick by focusing too much on national level policy making, whereas actually there's a huge amount going on that's making a day-to-day difference to people's lives by people who may not have the same access to evidence and so on that national level players do have. So do you think it would have been different had you been running this experiment at national level, essentially, in Brazil? That's me. I'll stop talking for a moment. We'll take maybe 2 or 3 more questions and let you answer. Could you introduce yourself before you...
I'm Lucia Fry. I head up the research and policy work at the Malala Fund. I think it's sort of related to Susanna's first question, and I'm far from being honest, so forgive me if this is out of scope of the work, but did you, is there anything one can infer or any, was there any test of how these policymakers' propensity to respond to the research would change in a situation where they were facing a trade-off? Because that's, from the point of view of somebody who tries to influence things like spending decisions, that's when the tyre hits the road, right? They've got to choose between investing in the ECD program or in an infrastructure program that's going to give lots of men. Whereas your ECD program is going to give lots of women jobs. And your infrastructure, you know you've got a problem with men voting. Which, is there any track that we can follow that leads us there?
I think it's 87%.
That would be interesting.
It's kind of related to this, but I was kind of interested in, hi, I'm Matthew Fuchs from RTI. Gautam, that was great to talk, thank you. In the individual differences in the mayors in the first study, and presumably there's some research skeptics among those people. There's people very favourable towards research, and presumably I was thinking that your willingness to pay measure was an indicator of that, and whether that was related to their willingness to take up research.
Right.
And I have one follow-up suggestion, which is about conducting an RCT where you present the results of this study and see if they're convinced about the value of research by a research study.
My name is Vinny. I'm just a private advisor. That last question becomes very meta. I just want to check one thing. Did I, in the first set of numbers on the ECD thing, did I read it right that male mayors were statistically significant, sort of much more likely to ask for that information? And so, any reason why female mayors couldn't be bothered? I'm being facetious here. Is it because they already, was the sample size too small? Did they feel they already knew it? Maybe they already knew the numbers. I was just surprised.
Should I respond to those? Yeah. So the first question on who else influences mayors, I think that's a great question. We actually got some in the second study. We got some data on this that we've not exploited enough. Very rarely do they say in a baseline survey research. Sometimes some people do say it. There are some think tanks in Brazil that people know and will mention. A very common answer was other mayors. So there are lots of WhatsApp groups, and so we were pretty worried about. So one thing we did, for some mayors, we were able to capture a social network of other mayors that they talk to about issues. We've not yet exploited those data to understand are there spillovers. But there is some light we can shed on this. It's just that we've not used those data enough for me to give you solid answers. I did feel like I was surprised by seeing how often they mentioned other mayors that they talked to. Now that may be unique to Brazil because of this, confederation, and actually there's another confederation that's almost as big. So I think these mayors are fairly organized together and attend a bunch of conferences together and the like. Exactly. So one thing we could do even in our study is look to see if people who were in the network, mayors who were in the network of treated mayors, are also more likely to now use these reminder letters, for instance. So that would be interesting to explore. I think we don't quite have the data for enough people to be able to do that very well. And there was a question about whether focusing on national level policy making is a mistake. I don't understand enough the landscape of all these things, but my guess is more focus on these municipal level governments would be a good thing. This is certainly something as I mentioned, my colleague Ed Glazer, whom I've talked to a lot about these results, and he's convinced of, just because he thinks there's a lot of things we can improve at that level where there is going to be openness to information. And just almost by definition, the things that rise to the attention of national legislatures are more political things, are more ideological things. And it could be that research is going to be less effective at changing beliefs there. On the other hand, of course, maybe those are just more important things. And if you can have a smaller probability of an effect there, it's an effect on a bigger thing. So there's that trade-off that I don't know enough about, but my guess is, at least in the development world, we're not focusing enough on local level stuff. So you had a question about trade-offs between programs and how do you respond to or care about research when you're facing policy trade-offs, which is what you're almost always facing, is spending a dollar on this versus that. Now this again is, you've caught us exactly why we pick something like tax reminder letters, and why mayors are pumped about it is that this increases revenues. Now you do need to spend some resources sending out these letters, but really it is very inexpensive. And it increases revenue. So we really did pick, in that sense, a best case policy. Now, even within the domain of tax compliance, we asked them about other policies, some of which are quite costly, which some municipalities use. So a common thing in Brazil is financial rewards for paying your taxes on time. That is, you may get tax relief for the next tax season if you've paid your taxes on time this time. And we found that beliefs about the efficacy of those policies is unchanged by our treatment. But also, a little bit to my surprise, we don't find disadoption of those policies. Now, that's not a very statistically precise result, but you might think we tell you about this really inexpensive policy that seems to work. You would stop spending money on a more expensive policy that, although we didn't inform them this, I think if you look at the research evidence on those things, I think broadly those are not very effective. But we did not find disadoption there, which maybe that takes time. Maybe they're trying out this new thing, and if they feel it works, they then stop the other thing. But I think absolutely it would be good to know more about that. And a different way to have done our study would have been to not get beliefs about how effective do you think this thing is in isolation, but for instance, how would you rank these different policies on a cost-benefit ratio, for instance? Right? So that's another thing we kind of swept under the rug with our ECD study, is we asked you, what do you think the effect would be on test scores? But we weren't asking you to compare that on a per dollar of expenditure basis, right? So I think that would be a great thing to explore next, and we can't say too much about it. Then Matthew had a question about individual skeptics of research. I think that is partly what this variation in willingness to pay is capturing. Their skepticism about our expertise, about the usefulness of this endeavor, perhaps also their confidence about what they think they already know. We didn't explicitly ask them, partly we didn't want to be sort of super pushy or leading on this, what's your opinion of research and the like. But we do think there's a lot of variation in the willingness to pay, a lot of variation, and there's a lot of factors in there, most of which we were not able to capture. So it's true that male mayors, which was 87% of the sample anyway, were more willing to pay. We don't know that you had a nice suggestion there, which is maybe female mayors were already better informed about this. We've not looked at that. We can look to see if their priors were closer to what the research finds, or if they had a higher expressed level of confidence, in which case maybe you think you need the research less. We're not quite sure why that is. But most of the variation we can't explain. These municipal characteristics, municipality level characteristics didn't predict much. Do you already have an ECD program? Have you heard about ECD programs? And I think being male, these were the things that predicted your willingness to pay, but that explained only a small share of the variation. And yes, absolutely. So those lined up very nicely, both in a correlational sense, but almost in sort of this causal thing, because remember, if I randomly assigned you a big sample study, you would pay more and you would update your beliefs more. If I randomly assigned you a developing country study, you would not pay more and you would not update your beliefs more than a small sample study. So that's exactly right. So it could have been that you want information, but then you change your beliefs in different ways because you want to use the information to persuade others. You think you already know the answer, the research isn't going to change your mind, but it's a useful tool to have, an arrow to have in your quiver. That's not kind of what we seem to be finding. I'm willing to pay for things if I'm going to actually believe them, and the more I'm willing to pay, the more I believe them. Okay, yeah, I think.
I'm Kate Ross. I work with in the education research team. I think this leads on from the last point, and so we slightly had a bit. You mentioned it, and you mentioned it briefly, but I was wondering if you, in sort of looking, if you looked at all at the capabilities or technical capacities of the policymakers with whom you were engaging, and you mentioned it, I think, related to the mayors and sort of college education, but whether there was any, whether you went further in depth in terms of the types of skills that these policymakers had and how that affected their engagement or willingness to.
One on kind of question which you got as we're asking. You mentioned a couple of those. Fine details. Just, could you say a bit more? One of these policy questions outside the domain of it's a study, but incentive. Second one is just but when you showed why they found the last song, the fact that they were looking at implemented by government. Kids care about having some there's different. Sorry, last question. You may have put this in the numbers. Do you notice in the correlation of the willingness to any correlations with the wealth levels of the municipality?
Should I answer those? Yes. Let me just grab some tea because I'm almost recovered from a cold, but my voice is running out. Okay, so the first question was about the technical capacity of mayors, perhaps more broadly of the municipal governments they're embedded in or that they lead. We did look at some of these things. Let me see if I have any tables here. And we didn't find much. So, okay, no, this is the second experiment. which is, we invite you, do you show up or not, which is one thing. And there we find college-educated mayors show up more, younger mayors show up more. When we try and move all the way to the policy adoption outcome, we're not statistically powered. So 40% of invited people showed up. 10% of those adopted the policy. So we don't find any statistically significant predictors of that. If we look at a range of outcomes, I think just by chance we find something significant, but doing the statistics correctly, we don't find anything there, but we're not really statistically powered for it. In the other experiment, in the more lab-like beliefs experiment, do I have anything there? Okay. Okay, this is the only thing I'm putting up here. These are participant level outcomes, and here we find actually being college educated, being term limited, your age, your political orientation, none of these are actually predicting your willingness to pay. I guess I've taken that other table out, but this was also true for municipal level outcomes, that is richer municipalities. Participants from richer municipalities were not willing to pay more. Crucially, remember here, the currency are these lottery tickets, right? If it was how much are you willing to pay out of your municipal budget, then they might be willing to pay more, really because they're able to pay more. Here, it's sort of everyone gets 100 lottery tickets. To a first approximation, they probably, there you might think actually richer municipalities, people may value the lottery tickets less. So then they'd be willing to pay more, but we don't find that. So in some sense, if we think of this as really their inherent interest, there doesn't seem to be much of a difference. No, I'm not showing you this here, but we also have variables. Brazil has nice administrative data. We can see what share of municipal government employees have college degrees, for instance. And that also doesn't seem to predict in our two experiments much. So at least in this case, we didn't find that much on the technical capacity of the mayors, or the municipal governments affecting ultimate outcomes. Again, maybe we've chosen very particular policies where these aren't going to be constraints. Then there's a question which I now realize and remember I've also ducked on Twitter before ducking earlier with Lee's conversation. So we need to go back and dig through our old, baseline survey questions and pilot data on this. We didn't do a super systematic job of collecting what would you like us to tell you. We had people rank some policy areas, but then it's more we wrote down a bunch of things they said and have not systematically collated those data. So I'm a bit scared to, am I still being recorded or was it only the talk that was recorded? Still recorded, that's fine. So I don't want to say the wrong thing and have it live on the interwebs forever. But so let me say at least what I'm confident in remembering or things I was asked myself. For instance, on the ECD program, this is also something where there's funding from the federal government, and the federal government has, in recent years been trying to push ECD programs. There's going to be money available for it. So for a municipality, they're not necessarily seeing this as a really costly thing that if I do this, I have to do less of something else because there's earmarked funds that are going to be available for ECD programs. So once they get pumped about it and are told, the thing is effective, which may not even be the constraint to adoption in this case because they're getting money for this anyway, they really want to know how, like what kind of ECD program. Now, of course, there is research on that. There are meta-analyses, but understandably, people aren't doing RCTs where they're randomizing, do I use this curriculum or that curriculum or this kind of classroom structure or that for ECD programs. At least economists aren't doing that. There's some studies in the education field. So I think a lot of the questions were like that, very concrete questions. I think what are other things they care about or interested in? I'm going to duck that yet again, but we are going to try to work to pull out all the data we have and then add that to the paper or reply to that Twitter thread because I know that's a question of interest. I absolutely think there's issues with incentives for researchers on this. I think it really helps that in development economics in recent years, we've had leaders of the field be pushing us to do more useful work, to be getting into the plumbing, as it's been called, of how programs work. But there remain real incentives for us to always be doing some sexy new idea, some question that's never been asked before that relates to some economic theory, even if it's quite removed from policy. But at the same time, one feels like some of the leaders in development economics, also other fields in economics nowadays, are really focused on policy relevant work, and I think that helps. I do think there's a lot of very useful research that is not in economics. So when we were picking things to do, we said, well, actually, it's a bit silly for us to even focus on early childhood development or the like. Why not look at research on traffic, for instance? Like there must be lots of work by people who study traffic engineering and roads and so on, which would be very pertinent to municipalities. We ended up finding we found it so overwhelming trying to make sense of all of that research that we came back to something we knew. But my guess is there's a lot of useful stuff that's outside of economics, which maybe you guys are more familiar with, economics and political science and sort of allied fields. I completely agree with I think Tom's other point about external validity. You're absolutely right, and in fact we should say that in the paper. What we find is that on average they're not weighting research from different countries more or less. And in fact, I didn't show you this, but when we debrief people who, so you're exactly right, when we debrief people who liked research a paper from a particular country more than from another country, they were not perceiving that really on average as capturing external validity. That is, an equal number of people were likely to say the finding from the US is more relevant for my context, as to say the finding from Colombia is more relevant for my context. So it's more just that country turned out not to be for this policy, in this sample, the relevant variation in external validity. So you're exactly right. Okay, I think that got everything because I got Vineet's question as well.
Basically, do you guys have any plans of either going back or is there any evidence of 5 years that once people who did send reminders based on attending, when they saw either an increase or no change, what happened to their beliefs about the research?
Alexander, here at CGD. It's a very quick question. The likelihood to pay for research was related with margin made of gain detection when there is more political pay for research.
And then just a couple of ones here. Think about inserting into the mix. Quite a popular thing.
Yeah.
People also react. We were talking within the CGD when you're about how you could potentially try to do something similar among the aid agencies. So we were quite encouraged by. So it seems like good news that policymakers. It's not clear that the folks that are funding those policymakers and developing are walking the talk. So they're kind of preaching based programming, evidence-based policy making. Are our colleagues in DFID and the bank and other agencies kind of similarly willing to update their beliefs and make policy and programming? I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about an experiment.
Yes. Okay. So the first question was about could we follow up more and find out, did they think the policy worked once they've tried it, and does that cause them to update more positively or negatively on the effectiveness of research? That's a great idea. That would be nice to do. I guess one of the issues perhaps is, and I think we'd not necessarily have the statistical power to do this because, as I said, 10% of like 40%, so 4% of municipalities actually adopt the thing because of us. I suppose there were a number of treatment municipalities that were adopting it, using this already even before the research. Maybe we could also consider them. They were already doing it, and research tells them it works, then maybe they pay more attention to it. So I think that'd be very interesting to know. I think a related thing we did look at is where do they report, at the when we surveyed to find out, do you use this tax reminder letter anymore? We also then asked, where do you get, what sources do you access to decide, what policies to adopt? And there we actually don't find statistically significant evidence of the treatment group being more likely to say, now I use research. That is, it wasn't enough that this one-time exposure to a training session, which by all measures they were excited about, that many of them actually adopted the policy. That wasn't enough to just cause some takeoff where now they're out there searching for research all the time. So I do take those data with a pinch of salt, because I think could be that a number of people are over-reporting even in the control group whether they use research or not, but we don't see an effect there. So that's one thing. Actually, now that I think about it, that should be in the paper, which it isn't. At the paper, okay. The second question was, have we looked at political competition or the margin of re-election? We haven't. That's a great suggestion that we also received recently from someone else. So it's in the works, but haven't done that yet. As you know, I mentioned that the term limits themselves don't seem to predict much. Did we think about using a bad policy, sort of negative evidence? So absolutely, I feel like there's lots of cool stuff we thought about that in the end we didn't do, just for, we said we need to pick some subset of things to actually do, and this was one of them. So I don't know what the opinions in the room are, but the thing I was thinking about was these free laptops, where there's repeated studies now finding they don't boost test scores and so on in the short run. There is a part of me that worries that maybe in fact the benefits are not on test scores but on other things and in the longer run. So I thought that would be a good one to do because it's pretty expensive to do, presumably. I don't know, actually, maybe there's funding for all of these things, but external funding, but it doesn't seem very effective. It's quite expensive, and it doesn't take a lot of technical capacity to stop giving out free laptops, right? So it's like our tax reminder letters. It's one thing where beliefs might really translate into policy quickly. Some very early discussions we had with people on that suggested that policymakers may anyway think the reason to give those things out is the whole family uses them and loves them, and it's not really about test scores in any case. So we didn't go down that road, but I think that would be useful, very useful to do. Now, note that in our ECD study, a lot of people had prior beliefs that were too optimistic about these policies. So actually, a fair number of participants do shift their beliefs downwards when they're told, actually, this study was done in the US and or in Colombia with a large sample, and the effect was 0.15 units, standard deviations, and they thought it would be 0.4. So in some sense, it was bad news for them, and in fact, that made them less likely to be willing to pay for practical implementation information at the end. So we didn't find any evidence of sort of asymmetric updating where they only move positively. We were able to test that quite precisely. They do shift their beliefs down as well. But of course, in the tax reminder letter thing, I think we would think of that mostly as, wow, I'd never even thought about this policy, and gee, it works. And then my handwriting is terrible here. Oh, our aid agencies and our funders also open to evidence on this stuff. So there, I think these two recent papers, which are very complementary to what I presented by Vivelt and Coville, and the Meta-Keta paper, both of which are cited in my paper, have a sample that includes many more, say, World Bank employees, Asian Development Bank employees, and sort of more people from the aid sector and so on. Now, I definitely don't want to take this distinction too seriously, but the Wivel and Coville paper does find evidence of behavioral biases in the sense it finds asymmetric updating, that is reacting more to good news about the effect of something and kind of neglecting bad news that it doesn't work, and does find that these people, that these participants ignore confidence intervals, and we don't find any asymmetric updating. We don't test confidence intervals, but we do show this response to sample size, which is a bit contrary to neglecting confidence intervals. So our politicians in Brazil actually, in some sense, might be less biased in processing this information than the sample in Wivel and Coville. The other paper, I think, doesn't directly explore behavioral biases, but I think generally finds a pretty Bayesian response like we do. But I think those other two papers are very well worth reading. Thanks very much.